And now I want to read a story to you that, to me, shows what God has done for us. And, I mean, it is a short story, but it's a long short story, so just sit back and relax and enjoy. It is an allegory. It's an allegory, which means there's a parallel to us and to God and His action to us in the story. And we've talked about grace throughout our study in Ephesians. We've talked about love, and we've talked about jewels. We've been looking for the treasures in Ephesians, and we've seen ourselves, what we were before Christ, and then who we are after Christ, and all the blessings that God gives us. So see if you hear any of those things just as you try to make connections between this story and what you've been learning from Ephesians. The title is The Coal Orphan. Once upon a time in a big, big city there was a little 5 and dime. But this was a special 5 and dime because it was owned by a special man named Mr. Hesed. And I'll just pause. Hesed is the Hebrew word for loving kindness. Most people in the city had never discovered the store, but those who had, did not mind going out of their way to visit the special place, even though it was on the very edge of the city. The best way to describe Mr. Hesed would be to say that he was like a Jewish Santa Claus. He was friendly, fair, and gentle. It was easy to be merry in his presence because his merriment was a contagious thing. Kindness exuded from him in a way that made the regular city folk wonder if it hadn't all been drained from the city and poured into this one man. Yet Mr. H, as they called him, was no pushover. He was not old, but he was definitely not young. No one could tell his age, and he never told. Even more important than his age was his strength. When he saw some injustice, whether it be a shoplifter in his own store, or some rough, mean people harassing the helpless, his softness took on a surprising sternness. His sudden, gruff authority always induced the offenders to stop, sending some scurrying away in shame. His strength was not physical, but something beyond muscle, partly emotional, partly psychological. It seemed to sink into the depths of the soul. The store itself had a mythical air about it. No muzak played in it, yet there was no more calming, soothing place in all of the city. That's why the city people who knew about it liked it so much. It was more relaxing than their expensive trips to the Bahamas, and more restorative than a week on the ski slopes of Switzerland. People came to visit the store like they would a museum. Purchasing items almost seemed a superfluous act in Mr. H's store, and the children. There were always children in the store. Mr. H could often be seen chatting with them and enjoying their company as much as he did any adults. He loved the children, and they loved him. They loved him not only because he was generous with his candy jars, but because they felt in their bones how much he loved them. Mr. H loved everybody. There was one little girl, an orphan, who came to see Mr. H every day. She would come running in and call for him, to say hello, and to give him many hugs. He loved all the children the same, even the ones who tried to steal from him and who always got caught. But he took special care of this little girl and called her daughter, for she had no mother or father to look after her. She lived on the streets and had to beg and do odd jobs for a living. But because she was still a child, when she ran into Mr. H's store, her eyes would be shining with hope, and the troubles of her world fell away in the joy of his presence. One day after she had run in for her daily hug, she disappeared into the aisles as he rang up some customers and chatted with them. When they had left, he called out for her, "Daughter, where are you?" "Over here," she answered. "Come here and see." When he found her, she was the most comical sight. She was kneeling on the floor by the coal barrel and had picked up some lumps in her hands. She was caressing them, stroking them gently as she held them to her cheek, her eyes closed in enraptured bliss. She was covered from head to toe with streaks of coal. "Aren't they glorious? They feel so soft, and I've seen what they do. They make fire." fire that burns for a long, long time. Have you ever seen anything so black and beautiful? And the fire, it is such a warm fire. Absolutely perfect. For living on the streets, she had seen homeless people who were lucky enough to have lumps of coal to burn during the cold, cold nights in the city. She knew those fires were brighter and hotter than all the others she had built with cardboard or wood. "How much are they, Mr. H?" she asked. He replied sadly, 20 cents a lump. Times were hard, and the price of coal was high. He knew that she'd never be able to scrape the pennies together, let alone find people who could afford to give them up. The little orphan girl's eyes brightened. "I'll get it. I'll get some money. I will." And she clutched a lump of coal to her already darkened dress and nuzzled it with her cheek. "Yes, my daughter, I'm sure you will," he said comfortingly. He tousled her coal-streaked hair and gave her a hug and said, "But first you must have a piece of candy." And he took her hand and led her to the front of the store, where he pulled out the brightest lollipop from his candy shelf and gave it to her. "Thanks, Mr. H," she said. "I'll be back in no time to get me my coal." She quickly kissed him on the cheek and skipped out the door with her lollipop. Every day she came in to say hello to Mr. H and then ran over to the coal barrel for a few minutes to look at it and stroke it longingly. Sometimes she'd bring her friends in to show them her treasured coal. "Isn't it beautiful?" she would say. Some nodded in agreement, some just laughed at her. But all quickly lost interest and began to wander the store in search of more entertaining finds, leaving her to gaze and finger the much-desired coal. Out on the street every day, she worked hard to stay alive and find the 20 extra pennies besides. She stood on the street corners asking for spare pennies, but almost everyone who saw her, they saw her cold-streaked face and hands, they turned away, saying to themselves, "What a dirty little orphan. The city really should do something about keeping them out of sight. What an embarrassment." She tried to get odd jobs, but the people who needed workers hired the older, stronger children. She was left with the smallest, most menial jobs that paid her only a couple of pennies. Finally, one day after many, many weeks, the little orphan girl ran into the 5 and dime, crying out to Mr. H, "I got it! I got it! It took forever, but I got it! I never thought I'd get it, but I did! Can you see? Can you believe it? I got it! I finally got it!" Ecstatically, she reached down into an old sock she carried and plunked the 20 pennies down on the counter. He smiled broadly. "And so you have, daughter." He walked over to the coal barrel and picked out the biggest piece of coal she had ever seen, almost the size of his fist. Her eyes were round with excitement as he handed it to her. "Now, wait, my child. I have a special gift I want to give you." "But this is all I ever wanted. My own piece of coal. And now I have it." She was overjoyed at her new acquisition. "I know, but I know you'll like this. It's even better than all the coal in the barrel." Her eyes widened. "All the coal in the barrel?" She wondered, "What is it?" "Do you want it?" She nodded eagerly. He said, "First you must let me have the coal back." Her eyes darkened a little and her little smooth, coal-dusted brow crinkled. She looked puzzled first, then angry. "The coal? But it's mine. I bought it with my own money. How could I ever give it back? It belongs to me." "Yes, daughter, it belongs to you, but I can't give you the gift until you give me what is yours." "But how is that a gift?" she argued. "You must see before you'll understand," he gently replied. As she hesitated and struggled in her heart, a tear ran down her face, washing a narrow trail of ivory skin clean from the thin layer of coal. He assured her, "You know I'd never trick or rob you, don't you? You do believe that, don't you?" She nodded. He waited and said no more. After what seemed an eternity, she gingerly placed the lump of coal on the counter between them. Mr. H picked it up and began to squeeze it between his hands. She cried out in panic, "Wait! What are you doing to my coal?" "Daughter," he said calmly, Do you want my gift? Do you trust me that it will be, as I said, greater than all the coal in the barrel?" She hesitated, sighed, and then nodded. He began squeezing again. He squeezed the coal harder and harder until it seemed as though his hands were burning red at times. It tore at the little orphan girl's heart to watch her beloved Mr. H destroying her precious coal right there before her own eyes. Finally, he stopped squeezing. His muscles relaxed, and he parted the front of his clasped hands to blow a little puff of air into them. Slowly, he held his hands in front of the little girl, who by this time was mournfully sniffling. She smelled a strange, burning smell. Then he unclenched his leathery hands. The orphan girl rubbed the tears from her eyes. There in his hands lay the most exquisite, brilliant, fiery, clear creation that she had ever seen in her life. She didn't know what it was. It looked like glass, but unlike glass, color and fire burned and leapt inside it. She reached out slowly to touch it, but stopped her hand in midair, afraid that it might burn her. "Go ahead, touch it, child. It's yours. It's called a diamond." She took it, stunned silent, as Mr. H watched her carefully. Cautiously she touched it, then quickly pulled her hand away. When it didn't burn her, she let her fingers run over the smooth facets. Mr. H offered it to her, and she took it, cradling the cool fire in her hands. She had to squint as she lifted it to the light and examined the daggers of colored fire dancing inside it. It burned more brightly than 1,000 fires of coal. She lowered the diamond and looked at it and looked at Mr. H. "Thank you," she finally managed to stutter. "Thank you so much, Mr. H." He said, "You're welcome. This diamond will buy you all the warm shelter, food, and clothes you need, and plenty besides. You'll be able to have all the fires you want." He lovingly stroked her coal and tear-stained face. All of a sudden she noticed his hands. There in the middle of his palms were two small red, round welts. It looked as if two red-hot irons had pierced the rough softness of his palms. She gasped, "Mr. H, what are these? What happened to your poor hands?" He answered, These are the price I paid to buy you your gift." She cried, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't deserve this." She flung her arms around his neck and covered his scarred hands with coal kisses. "I love you, Mr. H. How will I ever repay you?" "No, my child," he said. "You do not have to repay me, because you never could. Remember, it is a gift." She nodded and understood. I think that story illustrates the kind of love that Jesus has shown us. And this is the love that you're going to study about in your next lessons of homework. Ephesians 3:19 says in Paul's prayer that he wants us to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge. And I want to focus on that word surpasses for a moment. It surpasses. It goes beyond the ordinary, beyond the scientific, beyond the factual knowledge that we might try to know. You cannot quantify the love of Christ. And Paul has used this word surpassing 3 times already, and he is always using big words to try to help us grasp that which we cannot grasp. It is beyond what we can know. In his commentary on Ephesians, F.F. Bruce says, "The love of Christ is so profound that we will always find it deeper than we have experienced, and it is so vast that it will never be known in its entirety by our human minds." To speak of knowing something that surpasses knowledge is to be deliberately paradoxical. But however much one comes to know the love of Christ, there is always more to know. It is inexhaustible. So we know it, and yet there's still more to know. The love of Christ, the love of God, is unconditional. It's not given because of any action on our part. The love of Christ is sacrificial. It is given at a cost. Because God is love, He sacrificed His heavenly fellowship with Jesus, His Son, and sent Him to earth. And God sacrificed His intimate fellowship with His Son for a few long hours while Jesus was on the cross. Jesus sacrificed His heavenly glory and put on our humanity. And Jesus sacrificed His intimate heavenly fellowship with His Father when He moved onto that cross and took on our sins. Jesus sacrificed His purity, His perfection, and His holiness for those few long, horrible hours on the cross. And He did it because He loves us. Jesus is our true love. His love for us is serious, it's sober, it's sacrificial. But we can also celebrate it. And there is joy in His love. And we can rejoice in the love that He has shown us.